Welcome to our channel. Are you ready to embark on thrilling adventures across the cosmos, encounter mysterious alien civilizations, and explore the unknown depths of space? If so, you've come to the right place. Subscribe and join our community of fellow sci-fi enthusiasts who love diving into epic tales and futuristic explorations. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an exciting new story. We want to hear from you. Leave a comment below sharing your favorite sci-fi moment, or let us know what kind of adventures you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create the stories you crave. Now sit back, relax, and prepare to journey beyond the stars as we begin our latest saga.
You are concealing something unauthorized, human? In the vast reaches of the galaxy, where countless stars flicker with the stories of ancient civilizations and untold possibilities, one seemingly small misunderstanding will alter the course of history. Commander Dylan Grant of the Earth Defense Force stood at the threshold of Zenith Station, preparing for a routine diplomatic meeting, though in his mind, it felt more like another chore to endure. The air was thick with tension, and not the kind that comes from the weight of diplomacy, but from his own distaste for dealing with aliens who always seemed to think they were superior. Today, though, something was different. As the massive steel doors of the Intergalactic Diplomatic Center parted, revealing the gleaming white halls beyond, Dylan's eyes were drawn to a figure unlike any he had encountered before. There, standing like a living statue, was Officer Ava Solis. With shimmering skin that seemed to reflect every light in the room and eyes that glittered like stars, she was more than just another alien. She was a challenge, a mystery, and as he would soon discover, the one person who would make him question everything he thought he knew about the universe. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. A simple security screening, the kind he'd gone through countless times, quickly turned into something much more complicated. Ava's intense gaze swept over him, and suddenly, her expression shifted from professional to something far more alarming. It was then that the true misunderstanding began, a misunderstanding that would spark an unexpected journey of distraction and a bond so strong that not even the stars themselves could stand in its way. Dylan stood perfectly still, trying to maintain his professionalism as Ava's scanning device hummed softly over his body. His mind wandered briefly. He had been through these security checks countless times before. There was always the cold, impersonal routine of alien inspections, but this time was different. This time, Ava Solis, the officer conducting the check, stood in front of him, radiating an almost electric tension that felt out of place. Her silver skin reflected the overhead lights, giving her a slightly ethereal appearance, while her piercing eyes tracked his every movement. As the device passed over his hip, it beeped sharply, cutting through the quiet. Ava's expression froze for a moment, a slight twitch of her fingers betraying the shift in her demeanor. She took a step closer, her body language shifting from professional to something more commanding. "Commander Grant," she said in a tone that was calm but edged with something else. "You are concealing something unauthorized." Dylan blinked, his mind racing as the confusion grew. "What? No, that's not." Before he could finish his sentence, Ava's voice turned sharper. "Remove your lower garments immediately." Dylan's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" he stammered, trying to process what she had just said. "Wait, no, I can explain." Her gaze never wavered, and there was no sign of hesitation in her actions. "Commander, I'm giving you a direct order. Remove your garments now. You're hiding something dangerous." The tension in the air was thick, and Dylan's heart raced. He wanted to argue, but he could feel the weight of authority in her voice, and despite the confusion, he knew this wasn't the time to argue. This wasn't a normal situation. Slowly, with a groan of frustration, Dylan complied. He stepped back, unbuckling his pants as quickly as he could and pulling them down to reveal his black underwear. Ava's expression shifted immediately. Her bright silver eyes widened in an almost comical mixture of surprise and embarrassment. She stammered, her voice cracking slightly. That's not a weapon?" "No," Dylan said quickly, trying to keep his tone steady and professional despite the embarrassing situation. "It's not a weapon. It's a natural response. Human anatomy, you know?" He gestured awkwardly at himself, trying to make light of the situation without making it more uncomfortable. Ava's skin, a smooth metallic silver, suddenly turned a vivid blue, a color that Dylan assumed was the equivalent of a blush. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and she took a step back. I didn't know, she muttered, her voice barely audible. This is highly irregular. I understand, Dylan replied, trying to ease the awkwardness. It happens, no harm done. He adjusted his clothing, pulling his pants back into place and standing tall once again, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. Ava's embarrassment was palpable. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice much softer than before. I should have known. I didn't mean to assume anything. Dylan gave her a reassuring smile, though part of him was still trying to process the absurdity of the moment. It's all right, really. We're all learning, right? She looked up at him, her face still flushed with that strange blue hue. I must apologize, Commander. This was completely my mistake. Well, you're forgiven, Dylan said, though he couldn't help but chuckle lightly. But maybe next time we could skip the detailed search? Ava's eyes flickered toward him, and despite the earlier awkwardness, a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Perhaps, she replied, her voice betraying a hint of amusement, though the professional tone remained. As the security screening continued, there was a new tension between them, one that hadn't existed before. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the situation. There was something unspoken now, a shift in their dynamic. As Ava conducted the rest of the scan, she kept a more professional distance, but Dylan could feel her occasional glances toward him, almost as if she were studying him with curiosity rather than suspicion. As Dylan and Ava walked down the pristine halls of Zenith Station, the silence between them was laden with unspoken thoughts. Ava had regained her professional composure after the awkward moment, but Dylan could still sense a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her earlier suspicion had transformed into something less rigid, but not entirely comfortable either. Ava walked with purposeful strides, her silver skin gleaming as she moved ahead of him, her eyes darting forward, but occasionally flickering back toward him. It was clear she wasn't entirely at ease. So, you're really not offended by that? Ava finally asked, her voice still carrying a note of uncertainty. She kept her gaze fixed ahead as if too embarrassed to look at him directly. Dylan, sensing the tension in her words, slowed his pace slightly to match hers. Honestly, not really. I mean, it's an awkward situation, sure, but I get it. You didn't know. He smiled reassuringly, hoping to lighten the mood. I'll admit, I've never been asked to undress for a security check before, though. Ava blinked in surprise, her gaze flickering over to him for a split second before quickly darting back to the corridor ahead. I never expected that reaction either. We have different protocols, of course, but I didn't know your anatomy could respond like that. Well, now you do, Dylan replied with a teasing grin, though his tone remained light. It's just biology. Can't really control it. Ava's lips twitched in what could almost be called a smile, though it was still somewhat forced. Right. Biology. He paused, considering her words carefully. I suppose humans are more complex than I anticipated. Complex? I like to think of us as straightforward, Dylan said, raising an eyebrow. We just don't have the luxury of hiding our reactions. What you see is what you get. Ava turned to face him then, the light above catching the shimmering patterns on her skin. Straightforward, huh? I suppose that's one way to put it. Her voice softened as she continued. I've been studying humans for a while now, but I'm still learning. You're nothing like what I expected. Dylan chuckled, leaning slightly against the wall as they reached the end of the hallway. I imagine the other species you've worked with are a little less unpredictable? Ava hesitated before answering, her gaze falling to the floor. Unpredictable is one way of describing it. She met his eyes again, her voice quieter. You humans seem to wear your emotions on your sleeves. There's no hiding it. It's interesting. Dylan, sensing the vulnerability in her words, offered a more serious response. Well, we're emotional creatures. Doesn't make it easier to deal with sometimes, but I guess it makes us real. What about you? You seem so controlled. I've never seen you react like that before. Ava's expression shifted, her silver eyes narrowing as if she was contemplating his question. We Zalorians, well, we don't express our emotions the way humans do. We're taught to keep everything in check. Control is everything. We don't have the luxury of letting our feelings show. She glanced away as if lost in thought. It's a lot easier that way, or at least that's what we've been told. So, you're not allowed to be human? Dylan asked softly, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Ava's gaze flickered to him, and for a moment she looked as though she might speak, but then she simply nodded. In a way, yes. We suppress a lot of what we feel. We're trained to be efficient, to focus on the task at hand. Personal emotions get in the way. Dylan was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. He knew from his experience with various alien species that each culture had its own way of processing emotions and connections, but hearing it from Ava made it feel more real. Sounds exhausting. It is, she admitted, looking down at her hands. But it's how we've been raised, and it's easier to keep things professional that way. No complications. Except for when we're accidentally undressing in front of each other during a security check, Dylan added with a grin, trying to lighten the mood again. Ava let out a small laugh, the sound unexpectedly light and almost melodic. Right? Except for that. They both stopped in front of a set of doors, leading into a briefing room where their mission would be discussed. Ava straightened up, her professional mask slipping back into place. We're here. I'm still required to oversee the rest of the briefing, Commander. Understood, Dylan replied, though his tone held a hint of amusement. But, maybe we could ease up on the full-body searches from now on? Ava met his gaze, her silver skin flushing faintly with the blue hue again. We'll see how things go, she said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. With that, the door slid open, and they both walked inside, the tension between them lingering in the air. Ava's earlier suspicion was gone, replaced by something more complex. Curiosity, intrigue, maybe even a small seed of understanding that had begun to grow. Dylan, too, felt the shift. Despite everything, despite the awkwardness, he found himself strangely drawn to her. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and even if the situation had started out badly, there was something about their connection that felt right. For once, he found himself genuinely looking forward to whatever came next. The briefing room was filled with the low hum of quiet conversation and the whir of holographic displays flickering with mission data. Dylan took a seat near the front, his eyes scanning the table where several high-ranking representatives from both human and alien delegations were already seated. Ova, standing next to him, adjusted her uniform and surveyed the room, her silver skin glowing softly under the dim lights. Despite her calm exterior, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them during their conversation in the corridor. The presentation began with a detailed explanation of the mission's objectives: to investigate mysterious energy signatures in the Proxima Centauri system. The data was complex, and several analysts from both sides worked together to interpret the findings. But through the long session, Dylan found his attention repeatedly drifting back to Ava, seated across from him. She was every bit the professional, focused, composed, her attention entirely on the briefing. But there was something different in the way she sat now. Her posture was straighter than usual, her gaze occasionally meeting his across the room. When their eyes met, she didn't look away immediately. Instead, there was a brief moment of shared understanding, something unspoken but undeniably present. Dylan shifted in his seat, trying to focus on the information being presented, but his thoughts were drawn back to the subtle changes in their interaction. The quiet, lingering glances they exchanged felt like a language of their own, something that transcended the usual formalities of diplomacy. He wasn't imagining it. There was something between them, something that neither of them could deny. A break in the briefing finally allowed the room to stretch its legs. As the others dispersed to refresh their coffee or discuss the mission details further, Dylan found himself standing up to stretch his legs. He hadn't realized how tense he was until he moved. He glanced toward the corner of the room, where Ava was speaking with one of the delegates. She was engaged in conversation, but when she noticed Dylan approaching, she excused herself and walked over to him. "Commander," she said, her voice still formal, but with a note of warmth that hadn't been there before. "We need to go over a few of the mission details later. I'll be coordinating with you directly." Dylan nodded, keeping his voice professional as well. "Of course, I'm looking forward to it." As she started to turn away, he spoke up, his words coming faster than he intended. Ava, about earlier. She stopped in her tracks, her silver eyes meeting his. For a moment they stood there, the noise of the room fading away as a silence settled between them. There was something heavy in the air now, not uncomfortable, but charged with the electricity of shared experiences and the unexpected direction their relationship had taken. "It's fine," she said quietly, almost cutting him off. "You don't need to explain it. I understand now." Dylan's eyes softened, his lips curling into a small smile. "I just didn't want you to think I was, I don't know, embarrassed or uncomfortable." Ava smiled back, the blue tinge to her skin now replaced by a subtle silver glow that seemed to indicate the shift in her mood. "You were just being yourself. I think I can understand that better now." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "Maybe. We both have a lot to learn about each other." Dylan felt the familiar pull again, the desire to understand her more, to learn not just about her as an officer, but about the person standing in front of him. "I'd like that," he replied simply, his voice low. Before Ava could respond, the doors to the briefing room slid open, signaling the resumption of the session. The room quickly returned to its professional rhythm, but the brief exchange had shifted something deeper between them. As they both returned to their seats, the dynamic between them was no longer just one of duty or formality. It was something else, something personal. The next part of the briefing continued with a focus on the mission's objectives and the technical aspects of their planned exploration of Proxima Centauri. But for Dylan, his thoughts kept drifting back to Ava. They were, without a doubt, going to have to work closely together, but the connection they had started to form now went beyond the task at hand. After the session, Dylan found himself walking alongside Ava as they made their way to the next briefing room. The air between them felt lighter now, less strained. And though they hadn't spoken much since the break, there was an unspoken bond between them, something he could sense, and that, seemed, Ava was beginning to recognize too. "So about that mission," Dylan began, trying to redirect his thoughts to the task at hand. "Any specifics you think we should be ready for?" Ava turned to him, her gaze sharp but thoughtful. "It's not just about the energy signatures. We've been getting strange readings from the planet's atmosphere. Something doesn't quite add up." She paused, her lips curling into a small smile. "I think it'll be a challenge, but you and I are used to challenges, right?" Dylan chuckled. "I think I'm getting used to unexpected situations with you." He gave her a sideways glance, his voice turning playful. "I've certainly never been in a briefing quite like this before." Ava raised an eyebrow, her silver eyes gleaming with a hint of mischief. "You're full of surprises, Commander." As they continued walking, the mutual respect they were beginning to develop felt more natural now, the walls that had initially divided them beginning to crumble. Whether it was the unexpected nature of their initial meeting or the shared moments of vulnerability that followed, they were on the cusp of something neither of them had anticipated. A bond formed not just from duty, but from something deeper, a connection forged in the unlikeliest of places. As the briefing wrapped up, Dylan and Ava found themselves lingering behind, each caught up in the flow of the moment, but with the undeniable pull of something deeper between them. They hadn't shared many words since the mission details were outlined, but their unspoken communication was growing clearer with each passing second. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a tension that neither of them had expected when they first met. But there it was, hanging thick in the air. Ava was scanning the digital display on the wall, her attention focused on the mission logistics. Dylan couldn't help but watch her, the way her silver skin shimmered in the soft light. He had never been this aware of someone before, and certainly never someone from another species. The complexity of their interactions intrigued him, and there was a part of him that wanted to know more. "Commander," Ava said suddenly, her voice cutting through his thoughts, "I'll be overseeing the security detail when we arrive at Proxima. You'll be briefed on the specifics once we reach the surface, but there's one thing we need to discuss before we proceed." Dylan snapped out of his thoughts, focusing on her words. "Of course. What's the issue?" Ava's silver eyes met his directly. "I'm not sure we can trust the data. There's something off about the energy signatures we're receiving. I believe there's more to this mission than we've been told. Dylan raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? You think someone's hiding something? Her expression hardened. I don't know, but we need to be prepared for anything. There's something about the readings, something I can't quite place. It's almost as if. She paused, her gaze flicking toward him before quickly looking away. As if we're being watched. Dylan felt a shiver run down his spine. The tone in her voice was serious, and the intensity of her gaze was enough to make him question the nature of their mission. Are you saying there's a threat we don't know about? I'm not sure yet, Ava replied, her voice low and steady. But I don't trust the situation, and I trust you. If we're going into this, we need to be aligned. For a moment, the two stood in silence, their eyes locked. Dylan couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this kind of connection with someone, especially not with an alien officer. But with the gravity of the mission ahead, the weight of their words seemed even heavier. Aligned how? Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the unspoken tension between them making the words feel more intimate than they should. Ava stepped closer, her silver skin almost glowing in the low light. We need to be able to depend on each other, she said softly. More than just as colleagues, we need trust. Her gaze dropped to the ground for a second before she met his eyes again. We're about to face something we might not be ready for. Dylan felt his pulse quicken, the realization of the mission and of what it might mean for both of them, hitting him. They were about to step into the unknown, and in some strange way, that uncertainty mirrored the growing bond between them. He didn't know where this would lead, but he felt an undeniable pull toward Ava, something that went beyond duty and beyond the mission. I trust you, Ava, he said, his voice firm but laden with something else. I've got your back, no matter what we face. Ava's lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but then the door to the briefing room slid open, interrupting them. The sound of footsteps echoed, pulling them both back to reality. Ava quickly stepped away, her professional mask slipping back into place. But the lingering electricity in the air remained, neither of them willing to address the deeper feelings that had begun to surface. I need to go over the security protocols, she said, her voice brisk once more. We'll reconvene later, Commander. Dylan nodded, his own heart still racing from the intensity of their conversation. He watched as she turned and walked out of the room, her silver skin shimmering in the dim light. The connection between them was undeniable now, and though the mission had just begun, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that what they were about to face was much bigger than either of them had anticipated. As Dylan left the briefing room to join the others, his mind was consumed with thoughts of Ava. The way she had looked at him, the weight of her words, there was something there, something deeper than either of them had acknowledged. The mission was a crucial one, but the unspoken tension between them was almost impossible to ignore. Later that evening, after the final debriefing, Dylan found himself alone in the station's quiet corridors, trying to make sense of everything. He had to focus on the mission, but there was one thought that kept creeping into his mind. How far would their partnership go? The intensity between them couldn't be ignored, and with the looming uncertainty of their mission, there was only one thing Dylan knew for sure. Things between him and Ava were about to change forever. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. The team, composed of both human and Zalorian personnel, was deep into the final stages of their mission briefing. Dylan and Ava, now co-leading the mission, found themselves in constant communication, strategizing, discussing potential threats, and reviewing every detail. The gravity of the situation hung over them like an ever-present cloud. But it was something else, something personal, that began to weigh heavier on Dylan's mind. Their professional relationship had transformed in subtle ways. The glances exchanged, the way their conversations had shifted, the moments of silence between them that seemed to stretch longer than necessary. All of it was building to something inevitable. Dylan couldn't deny the pull between them any longer, though it made him feel vulnerable in a way he wasn't accustomed to. That afternoon, they found themselves alone in the mission planning room, reviewing the final holographic maps of the Proxima Centauri system. The hum of the room's technology was the only sound as they bent over the display, pointing out key areas of interest and laying out the plan for their arrival. "We'll need to be cautious when we arrive," Ava said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying a hint of tension. "The energy readings are fluctuating. We don't know what we're walking into yet." Dylan nodded, but he couldn't help but notice the small quiver in her voice. He turned slightly to face her, his voice softer. "Ava, what's really going on? I know there's something you're not telling me." Ava's eyes met his, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. The silence between them was thick, laden with the weight of everything left unsaid. Finally, she spoke, her words almost a whisper. "I don't trust it, Dylan. I don't trust them. There's more to this mission than we've been told, and I don't know if I can keep it all together if we don't figure this out before we go." Dylan was taken aback by her honesty, and for the first time he saw a crack in her armor, a vulnerability he hadn't expected from someone so composed. It was rare in his experience to see someone in her position, especially from another species, willing to admit fear or doubt. It made him respect her more than he already had. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly, stepping closer. "Whatever's going on, we'll face it together. I'm with you, Ava." Her gaze softened, and there was a shift, a fleeting moment of understanding between them that was more than just words. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about trust. And despite the overwhelming odds, despite the uncertainties that loomed over them both, they both realized in that moment that their bond was something deeper than either had anticipated. "I know," Ava replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "And that's why I trust you, because you're not like the others. You really listen." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. The words were simple, but they hit him with a force he hadn't expected. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that, how much he wanted to be the one that Ava could rely on in this strange, dangerous world they were navigating together. As the silence stretched between them, the air charged with something electric, something undeniable, Ava took a step closer. Dylan held his breath, every fiber of his being focused on her, on the space between them. Then, without warning, she reached out, her hand gently brushing his. The touch was subtle, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of warmth through his body, a connection that went beyond just physical touch. For a split second, they stood there, holding each other's gaze, a moment of raw, unspoken connection. "I don't know where this is going, Dylan," Ava said softly, her voice barely audible. "But I need to know that we'll make it through, together." Dylan's hand instinctively covered hers, his fingers intertwining with hers as he leaned in slightly. "We will," he whispered back, his voice low but full of certainty. "We're in this together, no matter what happens." The moment hung in the air, charged with an intensity that neither of them had expected. The mission, the uncertainty of what awaited them in Proxima, all seemed distant for a moment. In that space, there was only the two of them, standing on the edge of something new and terrifying and exhilarating. But before they could say more, the comm system buzzed, the sudden noise snapping them both back into the reality of their situation. "Commander Grant, Officer Solis," came the voice of the mission coordinator, breaking the tension. "We've received a transmission. You need to come to the briefing room immediately. It's urgent." Dylan and Ava shared a brief, charged look before she quickly pulled her hand away, regaining her composure. "We'll pick this up later," she said, her professional tone returning as she turned toward the door. Dylan followed her out, but the lingering sensation of her touch on his hand stayed with him. Whatever the mission held, whatever dangers lay ahead, they had already crossed a line they couldn't uncross. There was no going back from this connection. As they walked toward the briefing room, Dylan couldn't help but wonder how much this moment had changed everything. This wasn't just about facing unknown threats or surviving the mission. It was about what would happen to them, what they were willing to face and sacrifice, not just as comrades, but as something more. The briefing room was buzzing with activity as the crew prepared for their departure. Dylan and Ava stood side by side, the weight of the moment hanging in the air between them. The mission was about to begin, but so much more was at stake than just their success in Proxima Centauri. The unspoken bond between them had deepened in ways neither of them fully understood, but they both knew this was no ordinary mission and no ordinary partnership. "We're ready to launch," the mission coordinator said, breaking their reverie. "All systems are green. Prepare for departure." Dylan gave Ava a quick glance, his pulse quickening as they both exchanged a brief but meaningful look. They didn't need to say anything. Everything had been said in their quiet moments together. And now, all that was left was to act. Ava's silver eyes flickered with determination as she turned to him, her voice steady but with an undertone of something more. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Dylan nodded, his expression serious but filled with a quiet strength. "Together," he repeated. And in that simple word, all the uncertainties, the fears, and the unknowns that lay ahead seemed a little less daunting. As they entered the spacecraft and prepared for launch, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The energy signatures in Proxima were only the surface of something much deeper, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about interspecies relations and about themselves. The universe was full of mysteries, but the most complicated one of all had already begun to unfold before them, the connection between them. The spacecraft lifted off smoothly, leaving Zenith Station behind as the stars stretched out before them. The journey ahead would be long, filled with danger, discovery, and more questions than answers. But there was one thing Dylan knew for certain. Whatever they faced, it would change everything. As the ship sailed toward the distant stars, Dylan stole a glance at Ava, who was looking out the viewport, her eyes focused on the vastness of space. Her face was calm, but there was a spark in her expression that mirrored his own thoughts, an unspoken acknowledgement of what was to come. "We're on the edge of something incredible," Dylan said softly, more to himself than to her. Ava turned to him, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Incredible, yes, but also dangerous." Dylan's heart skipped a beat as he realized just how much was at risk, not just their lives, but everything they had begun to build together. But he wasn't afraid. He was ready. They both were. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," he said, his voice filled with conviction. Ava's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to step away from the responsibility of the mission, allowing a rare moment of vulnerability to surface. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Together." As the ship cruised through the stars, Dylan and Ava's eyes met once again, and in that shared glance, a silent promise was made. The universe was vast, its mysteries endless, but they had each other, and that in the end was all they needed. The unknown awaited them, but for the first time it didn't seem as terrifying. They were no longer just two individuals from vastly different worlds. Now they were something more, a team, partners, and whatever the future held, they were ready to face it, side by side. The journey had only just begun, but their connection was already something that could not be undone. They were on the verge of a discovery that would change the course of history, not just for humanity and the Zalorians, but for every species in the galaxy. And in the silence of the spacecraft, under the endless expanse of stars, they both knew that their adventure was far from over.